The Cuban Missile Crisis was a very historic event because it showed the tension between the US and Soviet Union. It is one of the closest times we have come to fighting in the Cold War. However, before we discuss the event itself, we need to look closer at what was going on in anticipation of the crisis. A few months after the failure known as the Bay of Pigs, Russia and Cuba, led by Fidel Castro, joined sides since Cuba wanted protection from the United States.
The Americans and their silly democratic ideals are nothing that Cuba needs. That's why I sided with Russia and allowed them to install their silos.
The US had many suspicions of what the Soviets were actually doing in Cuba, so they sent spy planes over to check it out. The planes photographed different missile locations, and soon after the discovery of missiles in Cuba, President Kennedy assembled his security team to develop a course of action. After several more days, the administration announced a strict naval quarantine of Cuba, so that American ships would block any more weapons from entering Cuba.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States.
For nearly 2 weeks during the quarantine, the USSR and US had missiles poised at one another, ready to strike at any moment. This was by far one of the most intense incidents in all of the Cold War. The fate of the entire world laid in the hands of the two countries' armies and navies.
Just targeted and ready to be fired upon, sir.
Stand by.
Приказ открыть огонь по берегу.
Wait! Russia and the US are having peace negotiations right now.
In hopes of finding a diplomatic solution, a UN meeting was called in which Adlai Stevenson, an American politician, asked Russia about the missiles in Cuba.
Let me ask you this. Do you Russians have any missile silos or medium-range missiles in Cuba? Yes or no?
Я не должен отвечать.
Are these missile silos in Cuba, and are these yours? Yes or no?
When the Soviets chose not to respond, photographic evidence was brought out to further prove the point to everyone that there were definitely Russian missiles in Cuba. Although the Russians were reluctant to admitting the missiles were theirs, the peace negotiations worked out in the end. On October 28th, Russia agreed to sign Kennedy's solution. The solution was that Russia would withdraw their missiles and disarm Turkey as long as the US doesn't attack Cuba. From the US perspective, the Soviet Union having nuclear warheads in Cuba was much more frightening than them having warheads overseas, which is why this event caused a lot of controversy. From the perspective of the Russians, having the warheads in Cuba gave them a sense of advantage as their missiles are so close to US soil. Although both sides could have chose to fight one another, the ideology of if you shoot, I shoot prevented that from happening. Thankfully, all of the politicians, Marines, and soldiers were wise enough to pause before launching nukes at one another, as the aftermath would have been devastating for both sides.